A lot of folks have asked how I got started in the UFO research business. It's kind of hard to pick a starting point, like everyone else since the mid-50s, when UFOs became a thing of the press. I was very interested. I spent some time at the Air Force Academy in Colorado as a cadet, and part of my physics science manual there did give us a little bit of official Air Force jargon about how to debunk UFO sightings and this sort of thing. So as early as about 1964 at the Academy, I was aware that there were official moves at hand to debunk UFOs, whether they were real or not. So after I got out of the Academy, I proceeded to go into normal business in the computing game in Dallas, Texas. As part of my civilian work, I was approached by the FBI to do some work to report on some chaps that I was seeing in business. And the method of payment that we worked out was that I would exchange information for information. And my information was I wanted to know more about the UFO cover-up and about something called Operation Illuminati that J. Edgar Hoover was quite keen on at the time. All of these things I have written about in my first book, the Cosmic Conspiracy. But in summary, I found that there was a government, what appeared to be a government-level cover-up to the UFO situation, and I determined to find out more as a civilian about where these things came from, if they were man-made, if they were extraterrestrial, if they were here, why were they being hidden from us? I couldn't really understand why. I got very close to developing a propulsion system for a primitive plasma flying saucer in Dallas at my own laboratory as a result of the research I was involved in. And through a very long series of events, I was introduced to a man in Dallas, Dr. James R. Maxfield, who seemed to know an awful lot about the flying saucer business from an official U.S. government point of view. As time went on, I learned that Dr. Maxfield, because he told me himself in his offices, was an associate of the father of the hydrogen bomb, Teller, Dr. Edward Teller, and that they'd worked together at Livermore Radiation Labs. They'd gone down to the South Pole on various excursions. They'd been under the pole in submarines together. And Dr. Maxfield informed me in one of our last meetings in Dallas that he and Dr. Teller had overseen some 52 projects similar to my own research in the United States since the early 50s. And he knew before I even told him, that Maxfield knew before I even told him what I was doing in my own research in my laboratory, virtually what I was thinking almost, and suggested that I finish my research here in this country, in Australia. So they arranged things for me through the Australian consulate and in San Francisco, and I was whisked away to Australia. I've left out a number of things that are germane, but it's for the convenience of time. I'll let you read that in a book somewhere. But once I got to Australia, I was able to find out a lot more information on the cover-up than I was in the States. I suppose, and I don't know this for a fact, I suppose that's because the United States government is so much in control of the media and people trying to leak things to the public. Over here it wasn't quite so tight, and I was able to find old yellowed and dog-eared copies of information and data that dated back to the early 50s that people here had collected, that libraries had back in the back room under dust. And then I started to write letters to Europe, and to England, the United States, to various people and places to find out more about the cover-up and who was making these saucers. Now, the first book I wrote about the man-made flying saucers because I was able to document enough to prove that we do have man-made flying saucer technology on the planet, to my satisfaction anyway. In fact, to the satisfaction of probably 500,000 people who've read the book now. The other source of flying saucers were non-human. And in my first book I only put about 1 or 2 sentences which I acknowledged that there were others not man-made, which I would discuss in the sequel. Now, I've just released that sequel book where I do discuss the encounters with mankind a long time ago, probably 7,000 years ago, where we had extraterrestrials visiting Earth and actually crossbreeding with us. So all of the things I have done have been triggered by previous events and research that I've been able to discover, and also by people spilling the beans on their department or their boss, or sometimes by disinformation leaked out by various governments to me directly. I certainly have had a chance to discuss this business of UFOs and extraterrestrials with some very unusual and very prominent people, if I were ever to name them. And it's mainly, I don't name them for any sinister reason. It's just that they are interested at a government level personally, but are not involved in the cover-up and are just wanting to know what's going on because they get little whispers themselves. In trying to understand why any government would withhold the technology we had, I came into an argument with a man by the name of Sir John Williams in Melbourne, Victoria, here in Australia. He was my contact and my prominent man in this area in Australia. He was my introduced contact from Dr. Maxfield's people. And I argued with him that we should release this technology because they were trying to underwrite my research in this country into flying saucer propulsion, not UFOs, but flying saucers, because we knew what they were. And I got cranky when I wanted to make things public and to tell people that there was a cover-up in the States, because rather naively I thought that Australia was a long way from America and from Europe, and it wasn't really part of the cover-up, and we could get away with a lot down here. But much to my surprise, it was probably at the forefront of the cover-up. And Sir John and Sir Henry Somerset and a few of the others that were involved in that side of it, quick smart cut me off from their organization and disavowed knowledge of my project because they were afraid that I was going to find out enough to be a nuisance. And in retrospect, I mean, some of what they were keeping secret, I think I would probably have done the same thing in their position because of the extenuating circumstances. Again, as I've printed in my first book, a secret is not always sinister. There are very good reasons because of public panic and reactions that people exhibit in times of crisis that you don't tell the public everything. In fact, while we're recording this is in 1991, the early part of the year, in fact before January the 15th. And Saddam Hussein, we don't know what he's about to do at this point in time, but the entire world is standing on the edge of World War III, or the greatest peace treaty we've ever seen. And all of these things that we see in the press now then do relate to covered up technology. There are a number of things about the U.S. military technology and their allies' technology that have not been made public. I get kind of tickled when people tell me, did you read in the paper today that the U.S. is going to use its new secret weapon such and such over in this part of Saudi Arabia to attack Saddam? And I think, well, yeah, I did read that, but do you believe it? I mean, Saddam reads the newspaper too. He's going to read the secret reports, and mainly these are things put into the press to gain public support for spending or various other things that are necessary at a government level to do what they're really going to do. So secret is not always sinister. It's clever. It's psychological warfare to try to win for your side, whatever side you're on. The cover-up of the UFO situation, in my opinion, is more than just a cover-up by the United States or by Russia or by Europe. I have had the privilege of having information leaked to me by a number of I guess you would call them ex-intelligence members of British intelligence and Japanese intelligence, who have told me more about the so-called cover-up. And one thing that sticks prominently in my mind is that around 1957, about March of that year, there were over 100 companies, universities, individuals publishing openly in Europe or in Japan and the United States on their own research into electrogravitic or anti-gravity propulsion for aircraft. At the end of that month, now this had been going on for 2 or 3 years, it was very hot property, this electrogravitics. At the end of that month, no more publications were seen in any of these things across the world. I checked through the old records and annals, and in 1 month, something or someone came across all of the governments that were actively involved in researching this electrogravitics and put a clamp on them, whether they be Russian, American, Japanese, Norwegian, whatever. They were all quietened. Now my contacts, 3 of them in particular, 3 of them in particular from Europe, explained to me that since World War II, that there had been a unit formed in Europe which had American, Canadian, Russian, Yugoslavian, German, seems like I've forgotten one, but they had all of these people, Russian Americans combined, had scientists from these groups working in underground labs, bases, on developing not new technology for flying saucers, but new industrial processes and complexes to make them. And there's a difference between that and actually building the saucer, or designing it or researching it. And these contacts explained it to me. If we didn't have the technology, you could understand you'd have secret labs to research and development, various ways you might make a flying saucer work. But that was not the case after World War II. This new unit, or intelligence and research unit that was set up in Europe, Saudi Arabia, and various other countries, in Norway, would get briefcases delivered to them by men in suits, young men in suits. These thin briefcases would have blueprints in them, and in these blueprints there would be instructions. Here is how you make an XYZ ray gun, flying saucer, a plasma cutter, whatever. It needs this kind of material, it needs these kind of components and these voltage levels and these frequencies. We know this will work. You go and develop the tools to make and manufacture these for us. So it wasn't design them. Someone was giving them an encyclopedia of new super high-tech devices. Now, my sources were never able to identify them. In fact, one of them, a woman we call the accountant, said that in a quip, she said, for all she knew, they could have been little green men at the top handing out the details. And I said, are you saying that? I mean, do you have a positive reason to say that? And she said, nah, just laughed. Said, however, I was aware of the capture of 2 living short little creatures in Great Britain off the coast of it after World War II in the early 50s, when a craft crashed near a village of about 1,200 people. And apparently the little beings lived for a number of years in captivity with the British wing of the unit. Okay, so we've looked at a global organization here that seems to have taken over 100 or more university research groups, countries, and people and corporations. Who is this group? Who was it? I don't know. I guess that it was obviously some group that had more technology than all the rest, and such technology that within the space of a month they could infiltrate every intelligence and every security system we had in any country, and deny them any more publicity to the public, shut them up and make them secret and take them off to some other place. I suspect. So I don't know that a one world order as such, as I've often talked about, is in existence at the moment. It's certainly trying to emerge, and even George Bush, President Bush, has said that he wants to see the establishment of a new world order over this thing with Saddam. And he's used those words. This is not sinister. New world orders, if it were properly administered by a perfect human being or a perfect being of some sort, would be great. But none of us are perfect, and such a world order is doomed to failure. We can't use a democratic process or a Politburo because it takes too long. It's unwieldy to make quick decisions in today's rapidly changing circumstances. You can't have a dictator because they go crazy. After a period of time they grow old, they get senile, something goes wrong. We don't have any perfect beings, so I suppose we're faced with one of two choices. Either we put our faith in a real extraterrestrial group that comes down and says, we've got all the answers, and we say, we'll trust you, or we turn it over to a computer of our own making, and that can be, in fact, that would be even more disastrous, because computers that would have limited decision-making capability would be prone to psychotic behavior if they had more than one value judgment programmer. You get value collisions, and you'd develop a schizophrenic computer. So we can't have a world governed by something like that either. I suppose this is one of the reasons that my own research took me way back in time, looking for answers before modern history, looking in the surviving Sanskrit translations in India, looking in the Hebrew writings of Moses, looking in the writings of the Greeks, in particular of Plato and of Solon, and when they got theirs from the priests of Suez in Egypt. And there, using all these sources, I have managed to satisfy myself that a long time ago we were visited by non-human beings. They were super beings by comparison to us. In looking at the Mesopotamian Valley and in Ethiopia, where we have some of the oldest known remains and also the oldest known civilization or signs of civilization or cities, I was able to see that the unexplained jump in the Mesopotamian Valley from hunter-gatherer tribes to city dwellers who planted and cultivated and harvested and had electric battery power and had seagoing ships and metal alloying. This one generation virtually jumped from primitive hunter-gatherers into developed civilization occurred because of a cross between off-worlders and the human indigenous species. It's in the Greek legends. The gods are quoted as breeding with humans and producing some pretty weird and wonderful offspring. Even in Genesis 6 in the Old Testament, in Moses' writing, in the Torah, it talks about the sons of God and the Nephilim, different kinds of beings which were down on the earth in those days, which had come down to the earth from a high place, and how they bred with the daughters of men on the planet, the earth women in other words, and how the unions, the offspring of these unions were the heroes of ancient legend, meaning Greece and Rome. So when I discovered these things, I had to know more about things like the legend of Atlantis, and to my surprise, as I've explained in the second book, The Vindicator Scrolls, we did find Atlantis. We did find what I thought was a myth at one time, the Garden of Eden in Ethiopia, the breeding ground. And Atlantis itself fits exactly the description we got out of the Egyptians and out of Plato. As to size and location, we found the Pillars of Hercules, not at the gates of Gibraltar, Straits of Gibraltar, but the Pillars of Hercules are two great big mountain ranges, which are the Lebanon, anti-Lebanon mountain ranges in the Lebanon. And Saudi Arabia and all of the Saudi peninsula makes up the continent of Atlantis of the old days. The capital of Atlantis, the capital island, which was a much smaller thing, probably less than 10 kilometers in diameter, is still, for the most part, submerged in the Persian Gulf. And this in itself is quite ironic, because the legends say that the Atlantean people became so corrupt in their ways and thoughts and evil doing and all this kind of rubbish and warring with themselves and their neighbors that the gods were called to a meeting inside the earth, now I'm quoting Plato here, to decide the fate or the punishment of the Atlanteans. And certainly what happened was that there was a great shift in the Saudi plate, the tectonic plate, and it dipped into the Indian Ocean, or sorry, into the Persian Gulf side, and started moving toward the Persian plate. And a large portion of it was underwater for so long that Egypt used to refer to the Mesopotamian Valley as the flood. My associates and I have found that references in the Torah to Noah and where he built his boat and how he built it, out of what kind of materials, led us to believe that Noah himself was a member of the Atlantean culture, and not just you know, this spindly, white-haired old guy out in the bush somewhere. He was quite a wealthy man, and he built quite a big boat. Friends of mine have gone over to Turkey and have analyzed what appears to be the fossilized ark on Mount Ararat, and have brought back samples of the pitch and various oxidized metal parts and hinges, which are right-angle hinges, and we found that one of the hinges had 93% iron, and some of that had not all that had oxidized, and 7% titanium. And we've just discovered titanium as a space-age metal in this generation. So 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, Noah and his culture had titanium-hardened steel. Found that passingly interesting. Now, going back to the New Testament, which is not a Hebrew writing, but written by Hebrews in Greek, in there it is told that great destruction is going to come upon the earth in the last days of this age, which I think we're in. And it says, during this time, it will be much like it was during the days of Noah just before the great flood, in that there would be a lot of chaos in the earth, a lot of people doing the wrong thing, and that there would be, we think it implies, in fact it says specifically in the Revelation, that there will be beings cast down to the earth from a high place as a result of a battle out there, not here. And it warns the people of earth to look out, because these beings are not going to be happy with us, I guess because we're going to be something like fodder to them. So that's in Revelation 12, I'm quoting from there. All these things fit into a very complex picture of the UFO situation, of the global so-called conspiracy, or the attempt to set up a global new world order by mankind, and the cover-up of the man-made UFO research programs, the squelching of it by some other unknown group. Now, I've certainly traveled around and met with people like Charles Berlitz, and discussed at length some of these things in their own research with Stanton Friedman, Dr. Friedman, with William H. Moore, with Bill Cooper, with the late J. Frank King, who was part of in fact, a relative of Agnew Bonson, who funded the Townsend Brown research projects. I've gotten a hold of a lot of film material and lab notes from Townsend Brown, these electric flying discs in the late 50s, early 60s. I've talked to Townsend Brown and communicated with him on this subject. We've investigated the Philadelphia experiment and whether it did or did not happen. I've talked to now deceased members of the British Atomic Energy Command who were friends of Einstein's, who were aware of my research into these areas with the Philadelphia experiment. All of these things that I've researched do tend to point to the fact that we have been invaded. I don't know why at this point they're holding back revealing it. I've never seen a little green man or a little gray, no small gray, no large-nosed gray, no Nordics, none of the kinds that Bill Cooper and John Lear and some of them say they've seen or know about. I haven't seen any of them. Even if I had seen one, it doesn't exactly prove they're real and not some kind of a genetic experiment here. However, I personally think that they are real. I also think that we're going to have a very turbulent decade from now till about 2001, 2002. In fact, it may go on until about 2004 or 5 before it's finished. Perhaps part of the problem is that we do have weapons that are advanced enough to be a nuisance to these extraterrestrials who are here. It may be that they need us for some other purpose I'm not aware of, whether it be to support them industrially, to figure out how to adapt their present bodies to this environment. Certainly that's been put forward by the Cooper papers, as far as their dietary habits and their ability to reproduce. According to the biblical commentaries on this, they will be here to simply to destroy, to go about and just destroy us in their wrath, because they've been defeated in another battle, perhaps in an upper dimension. I don't know how you explain it, but it's out there away from here. So we're faced with a very complex issue, and it's either going to have a very simple answer or a very complex one. I certainly opt for the simple solution, and even though I've opted for that, I still persist in looking at complicated issues within the problems we've got and short-term fixes for them like everyone else. We're not certain at this point. Those of us that research these things together, there's probably over 2,000 of us in some 20-odd countries across the world. We hook up by computer links about once a week. We're not certain about what I'm about to tell you. We are reasonably certain, we're guessing, kind of educated guesses, but we are reasonably certain that Russia is going to invade Israel and occupy it before the end of the century. In fact, it could be as close as the next 12 to 18 months, a guess. No prophecy, just a guess. Educated guess. Saddam Hussein may or may not survive what's about to happen, but even if he dies, there are 2 or 3 more little Saddam Husseins in Iraq who are worse than he is, believe it or not. He's bad enough. This is one of the reasons that the Yanks haven't tried to, the Americans haven't tried to take him out, because right now the American banking system is in absolute chaos as we speak here in January. I think it'll get worse, and so will the Australian banking system. It is too closely allied with the American system. We're going to be totally bankrupt. The Arab world has oil. The banking communities of the United States and Europe, Great Britain, have money, script, paper, based on resources, some of which are oil and the others are products and minerals elsewhere. You have 2 cartels forming. You have the paper money banking Illuminati type conspiracy I've talked about before, and you have the oil cartel, which it's the energy that makes everything else work, and without that the whole planet comes to a shutdown. So we could see a peace treaty signed between Israel and the Arabs and the United States and Russia and Saddam and all kinds of people. We don't speak about everything we find out, but certainly it helps us to try to figure out a pattern for what is about to happen. If John Lear and Lazar's report and Cooper's reports are correct, there may be as many as 12,000 aliens of some description or other in underground bases in Nevada and Arizona region of the United States. Certainly there's a lot of rumor to that effect, but you know, I don't know whether they're there. If they were there, I wonder why they would need any of our help to do anything. I mean, if they can travel as vast distances, they'd know our technology and much beyond that. There is something in the book of Daniel, an old prophet, which does say that the great, like the replacement for Hitler, the Antichrist, if you wish, of this age, the great military leader of the Middle East who will go taking one nation after another and list them in order. But it says this guy will plunder nations, and they name the nations, and will give this plunder, I think as I read it, to alien gods or gods his father did not know or his fathers did not know. In other words, like we used to talk about superhumans as gods, they were mentioning it. So it's only a brief and a not too distinct mention at that point about these aliens and whether they are going to be helping Saddam. Certainly, if there are aliens on the planet in that respect, the first lot, if I understand it correctly, the first lot would be, quote, the bad guys, and they would assist Saddam because they would be against Israel. Even from as far back as 1500 BC, before Babylon even, in India, they were talking about the battle in the sky between the gods of darkness and the gods of light. So we know that there is a battle going on out there. It's not the first space person you see or the first 2 or the first 3 cultures or whatever are good guys or bad guys. You've got to be able to determine which is which, to discriminate. And that's what we've spent a lot of time trying to do, is to figure out how to discriminate the good guys from the bad guys. Obviously we think we're getting fairly close, but we're just a private group of people, and we could be wrong. I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but I refer back to Revelation 12. Before I mentioned something else about some, I guess I would call it New Age channeling messages I've read from some crowd over in America. In Revelation 12, it talks about a third part of the stars of heaven being caught. These are beings, that's the number, but it's a third part of the stars of heaven, that's a lot, you can see, were grabbed together by the dragon and cast down to earth. And that's where they're going to make war, you know, like consume mankind. Mankind that's living on the planet at that time. Apparently a portion of mankind will be living off the planet, a large portion in one respect.
Would this be anything to do with the asteroid that's coming closer to the planet?
Certainly will be a major factor. The I must say, going back to the this New Age channeling business in Arizona, there was a crowd over there predicting that, or not predicting, saying they'd gotten, you know, messages from out there somewhere. Whether they did or not is another thing. Such things do happen. I'm convinced of that. But on their hearsay, they have said that somebody from a space fleet command from either Orion or something, they picked a formation out that is heading to Earth with a large flotilla of craft and beings. Certainly, I don't put a lot of credence in it, but I do consider it as a possibility. The asteroid impact is spoken of, strange as it may seem, in the disasters listed in the Apocalypse or the Revelation of John in the New Testament. And it speaks of a great white, bright star striking the Earth, which an asteroid would be if it did come through the atmosphere. And it will destroy life in a third of the oceans, and it will turn them bitter, blood-colored. A lot of things will happen when it strikes. It'll rock the Earth on its axis. Well, we think that's what it'll do. The Earth will certainly rock. And there's also another thing that's going to hit the Earth, which we think will be a result of the sun misbehaving, and that's called a burning mountain. Will fall into the Earth and pollute a lot of the streams and rivers and stuff with its fallout. And we think that'll be just a cool chunk of the outer surface of the sun, which we anticipate very shortly to go through a phase state change where the sun will collapse down. Its core will collapse into a smaller, brighter star and throw off the outer shell. And we'll get some of that debris, I think, striking the Earth as it passes through our orbit.
We've got happiness for sale. With Precon's amazing new genetics kit, you can choose the sex of your baby. Through the wonders of DNA modification, you can even choose the color of your baby's eyes. Blue, brown, yellow, green, it doesn't matter with Precon. Hair color, sporting ability, intellectuality, even race can be predetermined with Precon. A home genetics kit available from your chemist now. Precon.
Now you've asked how would the UFOs or flying saucers propel themselves? Say, for instance, how would they do it noiselessly? How would they do it without leaving a vapor trail or a wake or anything like this? And how would they get such an incredible amount of power that they would need to lift these large masses off? In fact, it would be a lot of power, because some of the indentations that have been reported in the sand have reported craft that would have been 30 or 40 tons in weight, because that's how much force it would have taken to press the sand down that far when these saucers landed, or UFOs. Well, I have an answer for that. At the moment, every device that I can think of that we use to propel ourselves in life, cars, feet, aircraft, jets, prop jobs, everything uses what's called a symmetric propulsion process. Isaac Newton. For every action, if this were a rocket out the back, there's an opposite and equal reaction the other direction. So if you have this rocket, you shoot gas out this way, you go in a line that way. It's symmetrically balanced in two directions. If you have a boat, you have a screw back here and it screws the water this way and shoves the boat forward. If you have a car, the wheel turns, shoves the ground this way and the car that way. It's always symmetrical. Now, Alan C. Holt over at McDonnell Douglas at the NASA in Houston, published a paper, I think back in '82 now, on something called asymmetric propulsion. Now, Alan and I don't know each other, but we both filed papers. In fact, I even filed provisional patents in this country for another kind of propulsion concept, which would cover things in water, in air, and in space, and in certain kinds of magnetic and gravitational fields. And we call it, instead of symmetric, asymmetric, meaning if you want to go that way with your craft, go that way, that you will push something that way also. If you're going to go that way, you'll thrust that way and you'll go forward. Now this seems pretty crazy, but if I turn my rocket around and open it up a little bit so that I can squirt water or magnetic particles or whatever thrust out the front and curl that stuff back in and in here and form a gigantic water wheel or space particle wheel or magnetic particle wheel, I'll have something that is closed. It's not leaving a wake. It will breaststroke its way through the environment. This is called asymmetric, or as I put on my patent application, it's called vortical insertion acceleration, VIA, V-I-A, VIA drive. Now, this was the first model I built in the water, and when I used this, or a variation of this, it left no wake behind the boat. It left ripples, or took ripples of water with it that looked like magnetic field patterns would look, and they hung on the side of the boat, left and right, as it moved through the water. It moved very, very nicely, with a small amount of power being required. I adapted then that concept to my shark boat. You can see it does look in profile a bit like a shark. There's even a rudder back there. In reality, in a full-scale model, you wouldn't need this dip rudder back here, but for what I was doing in the tank, I used a rudder. What I did here was pulse thin sheets of water out the front, like that, which then curled back around and came back underneath these gill slit-looking things, and I formed a treadmill of water moving around like this, like a tank. And this craft then made a very strong lock with the water underneath it, rose up on a little bit of mound of water, and went like that, leaving only a wake caused by this drag of this rudder back here as it hit the water. It takes approximately 25% less power to propel that boat. When I develop it better, and when Alan Holt and the rest of us are working to develop it better, we'll be able to use very small amounts, even 1% of the power we now use, to store energy in a great flywheel effect around and through a craft and its crew, and suddenly move it from this spot to that spot thousands of kilometers away without leaving a wake. Now, how do we know this will happen? Because we've tried it in controlled laboratory circumstances. I'll let you have a close-up of this to look at here in just a minute. I'll put it up on the board and you can take a close look. But for the moment, you will see that these are smoke rings that have been done in laboratory conditions, where the smoke ring has been shot from the tube here, and you see how the smoke ring curls and forms. Now, we did this in our laboratory, and we made a very simple device, just a plastic handle, a cylinder of plastic, and we put a front faceplate on it that we smoothed out and fined it down to a sharp edge here. Put a rubber diaphragm with a lackey band or a rubber band on it so that we could hit it like a drum. When I pull this back like this and cock it and then let go, it sends, in this case, an invisible ring of air, like a smoke ring, at around 90 kilometers an hour over to the target across the room. Now, we've done this experiment in a room filled with smoke and layers of smoke. In fact, all we had was a dark room with layers of smoke in it, oil smoke, from a theater smoke machine. And we had a little slide projector over in a corner just shooting a collimated source of light out. And we could see all these layers of smoke like they were really clouds up in the sky. And I took this thing here and I shot a high-speed invisible air donut through all that. And to our surprise, there was not a lot of turbulent wake where everything went smash and moved the cloud formations apart. If I'd have blown, like, you know, with an air hose or with my mouth going like that, I would have made a mess of all these beautiful formations of oil cloud in the room, but it didn't happen. This was like a little bullet, like a particle, right through it like hot knife through butter, and it only made the formation shudder like that as it went through it, and then all the pieces went back into their area. Some of them were moved a little ways down along the travel path, and that's part of the process, but we were amazed because it meant you could build a craft on this basis, a saucer craft, that would have a recirculating gas or plasma gas around it, or magnetic field, and it could take the top of it, instead of flying sideways, it'd take the top and it would form a partial vacuum over it, and when it went through a cloud, it wouldn't leave a hole. It would shut up behind it, just like this thing did. So we investigated this mechanism of the smoke toroid, the torus, the donut, and that's how we got into the water propulsion systems, and then eventually into formulating a concept for storing energy in the form of a pulsed electromagnetic field that stacks on itself and makes like an onion skin layer of was that my tummy? Could you hear it? Good. Like an onion skin layer of energy stacked on top of itself. In essence, it looks like this thing here, and we'd wrap coils around it like that, and another set inside, and we pulse this set of coils in relationship to these set of coils in such a timing mechanism that it, and also with the what's called the mu metal core, it causes the magnetic field not to be able to collapse back into the wires. It's technical, I suppose, to a degree, but what happens is we're allowed to take a Volkswagen engine, for instance, a little tiny thing, hypothetically, of course, and it might put out only 60 horsepower of electricity, but we're able to store that electricity in these magnetic field coils in the form of a spinning magnetic field that's self-containing. And after about, say, 10 seconds, you've stored 10 seconds of 60 horsepower. So you've got 600 horsepower you could use in a second, or in 10 seconds, or 100 seconds. But you got 600 horsepower from that little Volkswagen engine now stored in this field. So we let it run, instead of 10 seconds, 100 seconds. That's only not even 2 minutes. We now have 6,000 horsepower stored in this field, and that's enough to rip your arms out. Now, you build more and more of this with small engines developing this large contained field, and then all you have to do is be able to bend that field with side coils. That's the steering coils that you'll have up here, and bend that field so it warps the field, and you can take off in a particular direction at a great speed without leaving a wake. And in this case, because the electromagnetic side of it is, or the electric effects of it, and the magnetic effects are penetrating your body in the craft and the craft itself, when you make a directional change, it's not like a normal car or rocket that you get a lot of G-stresses. You are uniformly, all your molecules, you and the craft and your bum and your arm, everything all together, are uniformly accelerated in a new direction, and you don't rip apart. In fact, you could probably drink a cup of tea and not spill a drop as you went around a corner at 25,000 miles an hour. Kind of hard to conceive, but that's the way it is. Obviously, these exotic designs for recirculating craft are only as good as the propulsion system. So I determined to make an aircraft or a submarine or watercraft, any of these kind of things, we were going to have an electric accelerator. The Japanese, the Russians, the United States, they've all decided this some time ago, which is why they're working on what's called superconductor or MHD type boats that'll do 100 knots using electric drives. The movie The Hunt for Red October with Sean Connery came very close to telling you exactly how it worked when they call it the caterpillar drive, and how it squirted the water out with electric fields and magnetism. We've made these things, a number of us, it's not a secret, in the laboratories, and we've filmed them, showing how you can put electric current in water, like in seawater, in the presence of a permanent magnetic field somewhere, or a recirculating magnetic field, and the water will just squirt out, you know, in the direction that you point it, without any moving parts except the water. Well, now, again, it all seems to get back to you got to have power. In the movie Hunt for Red October, they had a nuclear power station on board to get the power to drive it this way. and they also just sucked the water in the front of the sub and shot it out the back, somewhat like an earthworm. And so they call it the caterpillar drive. But in reality, the best systems will have a long hole through the middle of the cigar-shaped submarine or spacecraft. And you've heard a lot of the reports in the UFO circles over the last 20 years to talk about the mothership, the cigar-shaped thing that was 10 miles long or something out there in orbit. Okay, I think it's quite probable that such a thing does exist, because you will have, like the little rocket torpedo type thing I was talking about, you will have a bulbous-shaped thing that will recirculate in fluid of space or water around it, and it'll have a hole down the middle and it'll recirculate like that. So how do we get power to it? I said, well, we started researching a lot of hearsay reports, and when I say we, it's been my associates and I over the last 15 years, looking for things in America and Europe and England and old writings here. And we found maybe 5 good patents or documents, whether they were patents or not at times, to describe new sources of energy, clean, tidy, electric sources of energy. One guy was a prisoner, I think, in the Arizona State Prison years ago, toward the turn of the century, and as a prisoner there, he fiddled and tinkered a thing together that made electricity for the prison. And then he marched off to Washington. They let him have a 30-day leave of absence from the prison to go and patent the darn thing. So there was one fellow. His patent seems to have not survived. He was granted the patent, but no one seems to be able to find him. Dr. T. Henry Murray, who had his own companies, his own businesses and other things. He was from Salt Lake City, Utah, I think. Very reputable man, well documented. I've even got some of his personal letters and stuff to another industrialist in the United States. Invented and patented a device to pull electricity straight out of the air. When I say electricity, it's like 10,000 watts of it in a little thing about the size of your household air conditioner. And he'd put up about an 80-foot antenna, not straight up, but sideways. And he'd lift it up on 2 support rods that would be about 40, 50 feet off the ground. And he'd spread them 80 feet apart and put this antenna up there and run it down these little magic boxes. And he'd light a whole bank of Edison filament globes, 10,000 watts of it, for days on end without it stopping. And he'd do it anywhere that you wanted to go. He'd say, look, here's my equipment, put it in a car. You take me to the spot as long as I've got a riverbed nearby that I can drive my copper ground stake into. And he would go and prove it time and time again. So we went after his patents. And my father, who was a solicitor in the States, I had him go for the thing in Washington. And they got there and they said, look, sir, the patent folder does exist. A patent was granted, in fact, several. But we apologize profusely. They don't seem to be in the folder, and we don't have any idea where they are. Now, here was a man, Moray, that died only probably 10 years ago, who had discovered a way of extracting energy in a most unusual way from something all around us. He said we live in a sea of energy. So out of all the different kinds of guys that we read about, there was Moray, there's another guy, I want to say Palacini or Perotti, something like an Italian name, in the States, and the guy in Arizona prison. These 3 guys all seem to have a similar source of energy, and their devices had similarities in how they pulled it out, but none of them seemed to understand exactly where the energy was coming from, even though the things worked beautifully. One chap, with the Italian-sounding name, he built his device. It wasn't any bigger than a couple of little bread boxes, and his antenna was only about that big around and about that long. It was just some wires stretched across 2 plastic hoops like embroider hoops, and his would pull energy right out of the air where you were in his room or his workshop, and that showed him lighting up lights. And he noted in his notes that when the wind blew, he got more power. When someone stood close to the antenna, he got more power. When there was no wind blowing, the power would drop down after a while. It was a clue, a series of clues. We went to Dr. Moray's notes and to his son's biography on his dad, and we have managed to figure out where the energy was coming from. And it's something most of us have seen in high school biology or physics. Take a drop of water and put it under a microscope and put a small drop of iodine in it and look under the microscope, and you will see the little iodine molecules bouncing around. And they call that Brownian motion, because all the little molecules of water are bouncing against the little molecules of iodine and doing it rather rapidly. But all this motion and movement is energy. Now, most people, when you say something is hot or has heat energy, they say, right, that means it's putting off infrared radiation. But that's only one kind of heat. The other kind of heat is in the translation of position, rotational spin, bouncing, not emitting a wavelength, but emitting energy in a form of collision. Which is why when you take, for those of you who have dry ice, you know, this carbon dioxide, a chunk of dry ice, you take a coin and you lay that coin on it, onto the dry ice, the coin will start to vibrate and sing and bounce until it freezes. It's because the molecules of that coin are bouncing so rapidly and are now being cooled so rapidly that it's uneven, and the thing starts to be kicked sideways by the uneven distribution of vibrations in it. Now that is the source of Moray's energy. It's the source of the Italian guy's energy. It's the source of the Arizona prisoner's energy. It is in all things that are not at absolute zero, which is virtually the entire universe. Now the trick is, it's somewhat like finding Maxwell's demon, which those of you who study physics would be aware of. Finding a way to grab vibrating molecules around, to grab that energy into a circuit in a short space of time before it has time to balance, and steal the energy out and shut the door. Now there is a way to do that. And at this point, our team is extremely close to proving this point. So we determined, by the time I'd written the Vindicator scrolls, that we could have this charged field, high voltage DC field, that we could mechanically compress and generate voltage from it. What we didn't know was where the energy came from to compress that. Was it super fast particles that came through the ionosphere from the sun or from space and collided periodically with this envelope we would set up? Dr. Moray's papers seem to suggest that the energy he grabbed was not electromagnetic in origin. It was more like a pressure wave, a hydrodynamic wave, a fluid wave, something like the seashore. It came in irregular frequencies and phases. So it was regular enough for him to go anywhere he wanted and light these 10,000 watts of filament globes. So we knew that it couldn't be the periodic strike of a high-speed, high-energy particle that did it. So we fiddled around and did a number of tests that didn't work, and finally realized that it had to be the mechanical pressure of all the atoms around anything, whether it be a copper wire or just a charged airspace. All these atoms are moving and bouncing around. And if we could go down and slice time, in other words, just take a very quick look at what's happening down there, at a certain point in time there would be more atoms hitting our antenna going that way than there were going this way. And if we could just stop everything except for that, the energy of all these little molecules would be enough to move the wire, you know, several feet from the impact. So we said, well, what frequency do we need to get down to trapping these bombardments? Of course, that's the secret of where we're at the moment. You choose a frequency range, not a particular frequency, because as you take energy out of anything that has heat, you lower its average energy density, you lower the speed of the particles, you lower the frequency at which you can take energy out. So you have to have what is called a heterodyning feedback circuit that sits there and watches what you're drawing the heat energy out of, or the motion energy out of, to see what's the best frequency to keep drawing energy out. In fact, the more energy you draw out of something, the more energy you can draw, because it starts to polarize little fissures through it coming your direction, inertial or vectoral fissures. So we're at the point now where we are very, very close to being able to tell people quite openly and freely, we will not patent this side of it, that here is how you make virtually free electric power. It is anywhere you are in space, on the Earth, on the sun, in the far reaches. It's always there somewhere because nothing is at absolute zero. It would mean that you could build a device like this, and hopefully simply enough with components that aren't too exotic, put it on your house, or in your house for that matter, on the wall, and you could, in the summertime, for those of you who live in hot environments, you could have the heat sucked out of the air electrically, this process we're talking about, and turned into extra electricity to do your cooking, to heat your bath water, and run fans if you want in other rooms for some other reason, I don't know, and get a free house cooling at the same time. You could turn your heat pump around by putting, say, a plate outside your window but electrically connected inside your device, and you could cool off the outside in the wintertime, cool it off even more in the wintertime to heat your home by concentrating the heat in your house. By doing this, eventually the heat would go out through the roof and back out into the environment, and so no matter how much heat energy you took out of the environment, it would go back to the environment unless you stored it in batteries. And there aren't enough of those around to worry about, so that we would have a source of power that would not heat up the planet any more than it already is, and would, keep the equilibrium, and we wouldn't have to worry about the greenhouse effect due to mankind anyway. So this is a very important power source, and if you boil the whole human equation down on planet Earth, the single most vital thing is readily accessible power. If the individual has access to that, no global society, organization, conspiracy, one world order, anything, can have absolute control over the individual. That is why it has been so difficult for you to find out about these things. You cannot regulate the use of power this way because people can make their own, and you wouldn't know how much they were grabbing, and it wouldn't matter because they'd put back what they used by the end of the day anyway. You can make your own fresh water if you have the power. You can make your own crude electric cars if you had electric power that was on board. You can make your own electric planes. You can do a lot of your own medicine making, or you might not even need it. There are just a variety of things that you can do yourself if you have readily accessible electric power. So that is why it's so important, and why we think there's such resistance to letting it come out. And if any of you out there watching this do succeed in doing what we're doing before we do, or have done, you should not try to patent it. Because the first thing that happens when people get one of these ideas is they run off to the patent office and say, look what a clever fellow I am, I want to patent this and I'll make lots of money. Something this large, something this horrific is the word I'm trying to say, I suppose, but this life-threatening to the entire planet, the control of it, cannot be patented. You cannot have enough power or money to protect yourself. You must give it to everyone. After all, the energy is free around you anyway. It's just a matter of how to get it out. You can make things with the energy that you can sell. You don't worry about the energy or the converter device itself. Give it away. Make it public domain in whatever country you're in. Publish it. Write about it. Make it a matter of public record so no one can patent it. It's free. But if you fall prey to the temptation to patent, as the original fellows that we talked about in this discussion, then you're going to run the risk of being bought off or dying early. It's not worth it. So do the right thing. Share. Give to the people around you first, and you will receive what you need from the whole community. Don't try to remove yourself by being infinitely wealthy and disappearing to an island. Make the community a place you'd like to live anyway, and you don't have to run off to an island.